On Saturday, Arab leaders in the Gulf Cooperation Council, or the GCC, reacted to the Qatari Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, who was reported to have taken a widely publicized phone call from the newly re-elected president of the Islamic regime, Hassan Rouhani. Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani has said that his country enjoyed deep and historical ties with Iran. He added that he wanted the ties with Iran to be stronger than ever before, and that he will instruct the authorities in his country to exert all efforts to develop relations with Tehran. Rouhani, in reaction, stressed that one of Iran's foreign policy pillars is the continuation of cooperation with Qatar. He called for the strengthening of cooperation between the countries of the region to bring about stability and harmony. The countries of the region need more cooperation and consultation to resolve the crisis in the region, and we are ready to cooperate in this field, Rouhani said. The countries of the region need more cooperation and consultation to resolve the crisis in the region, and we are ready to cooperate in this field, Mr. Rouhani told Qatari ruler, according to the Islamic regime's state news agency, IRNA. In this direction, we are ready for talks aimed at reaching a real agreement, he added. In recent years, Qatari officials who have gone out of their way to maintain strong ties with Tehran have signaled that they would much rather act in what they view as neutral, meaning half in the Arab Gulf camp, half in Iran's camp. This has come across clearly to both Tehran and GCC leaders as Qatar's willful refusal to consider the implications for his Gulf neighbors and itself. The Islamic regime in Iran delights in such forms of disunity and looks for these cracks in order to drive a wedge between the parties, as it has done in many instances over the last 38 years, most notably among Western leaders and the Iranian opposition. In the West, the regime successfully managed to distance the European Troika, Britain, France, and Germany, from the US during the early 2000s nuclear negotiations. Using the already stale air between Europe and the US over the Iraq War, the Islamic regime's authorities, with Rouhani, the nuclear negotiator at the time, at the forefront, was able to play that card so deftly that the Europeans gleefully broke from their Western ally, the US. In this case, the Islamic regime has found Qatar's leaders to be willing to stir the pot and partner in a game against the GCC. The Shia regime in Iran and the majority Sunni GCC countries are supporting opposite sides in the conflict in Syria, Yemen, Bahrain, and elsewhere in the region. Only when the GCC is divided and the member countries are at odds with each other can the Islamic regime further its hegemonic ambitions for the region and the soul of Islam under what they themselves have often described as the Shia pole. Ironically, Rouhani, in the phone call with Sheikh Tamim, claimed that sectarianism is a major scourge that affects everyone's security. Tehran's regime has promoted sectarianism, discord, and complicity in the Arab world via many means, not only its armed militias. Official Qatar media published remarks purported to have been made by Sheikh Tamim, which were critical of Trump's foreign policy and of the renewed tensions with Tehran. Qatari officials, however, claimed that the remarks published by their own media late on Tuesday were fake and that the news agencies that ran them had been hacked. Today we have Mr. Andrew Apostolou, who was the director for Iran at the Freedom House, joining us. Mr. Apostolou has testified to Congress about the Islamic regime's human rights abuses and has published widely on Iran and the Middle East. He has also worked at the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution, where he was the Associate Director of Programs and Publications. A native of England, he was the Director for Customized Research at the Economist Intelligence Unit, which is a division of the Economist Group. Mr. Apostolou, welcome and thank you for joining us on the Iranistas today. If I may begin by asking you, In your op-ed in the Washington Examiner today, you have mentioned that the Trump administration should put more pressure on the Iranian regime and its officials, especially in relation to the harsh human rights violations of the regime on the Iranian people since 1979. What do you believe the Trump administration should do in that regard?
Well, thank you, there is a mechanism they can use, which is under what is called CISADA, which is the Anti-Iran Sanctions Act of 2010, which allows the US government to designate human rights abusers. And the US has only designated around a dozen or so, and the Europeans, with their legislation, have designated close to 40. What the Americans can do is they can designate Ayatollah Khamenei because he's in charge, President Rouhani because he's also responsible, and then, of course, former President Ahmadinejad. They can designate them as human rights abusers. That means they can go after their assets abroad, which, of course, they do have some. It means that the US would start to deny them visas for travel. The US would ask allies to deny them visas to enter and overflight. And there would be all sorts of penalties, which are largely symbolic, but they're important because they signal to Iranians that America knows who is responsible and who isn't. The point here is you don't want to punish Iranians. Iranians haven't done anything wrong. They didn't choose this government. The elections are fake. The elections are largely controlled. The point is the regime has to be held responsible for its own crimes.
The Islamic regime has been responsible for many crimes during these last 40 years, and all U.S. administrations have been aware of the regime's violence and illicit operations both inside and outside Iran. What kinds of consequences and punitive steps, other than the sanctions, should be taken?
Well, so there are other things you can do. For example, you can demand that Iran come clean on weaponization of nuclear materials. This is something Obama did not ask for. And this is the most important part of the nuclear program. If you don't know how to turn the fissile material into a weapon, it's really not very useful. It's like having a lead mine, but you don't know how to turn it into bullets. If you can turn it into a missile, then it's dangerous. One thing that the American administration can do is prevent what's called the broader conclusion, which is part of the Iran deal agreed by Obama and the regime. And by preventing that, they stop the final sanctions being lifted. The other thing that the Trump administration can do is to demand limits on Iran's missiles. Again, Iran is entitled to have missiles. It should be able to defend itself, but it shouldn't have missiles that can deliver payloads many hundreds of kilometers away from Iran in a way that isn't defensive, but it actually is offensive. And those are two extra things. In terms of the broader accountability, look, the main important thing here is to get human rights back on the American agenda. This American administration has, in my view, very foolishly dropped the whole human rights issue. It's foolish for Iran and it's foolish for the rest of the Middle East. I'm not sure the administration will necessarily listen to me. I'm not married to Trump's daughter, so I don't have access to him. However, I think they are doing some of these, but they're not doing them in a coherent way, and they're not doing them as part of a strategy. You need a strategy. What are you trying to achieve with Iran? Obama, for all his mistakes, and I thought he made terrible mistakes on Iran, and I think he betrayed the people of Iran. I think Obama had a strategy. His strategy was forget everything apart from the nukes, get that agreement, and maybe one day Iran will be an American ally. It was a fantasy, but he had a strategy. Trump has no strategy. And unfortunately, because of domestic reasons, and they're all his own mistakes, his presidency is one of constant crisis.
So in your view, President Trump's trip to Saudi Arabia and Israel, which created a new narrative against the Islamic Republic, was based on strategy?
That's an excellent point. You're absolutely right. I mean, and that is part of the strategy that people have been suggesting for many years, which is reject the Obama approach, re-embrace America's allies. But you see, the campaign against the regime has to be legitimized on the basis of human rights, not on the basis of the interests of other countries. Because if you say we are trying to stop what the regime is doing because it's good for Israel, good for Saudi Arabia, or good for Iraq, or good for Turkey, or good for the US, then why would Iranians support that? If you tell them that it's for them and you show that it's for them, then you build a base of support in Iran for these policies. What you don't want to do is be getting into somebody else's disputes. You know, Iran and all the other countries have bilateral disputes, and there's something the US shouldn't really get involved with. The US should be trying to stop the Iranian regime from turning Iran into a vehicle for the projection of the Iranian regime interests. The point is, Iran is a vehicle for the interests of the Iranian people, and that's what we need.
Finally, what could President Trump do to get Europeans on board against the Islamic regime in Iran, given that some European leaders did not find his reasoning compelling enough?
I think it will have the opposite effect. You know, you've got to be consistent with people. If you're going to be nice to the Saudis and the Israelis, be nice to the Europeans. He insulted the Europeans. He talked nonsense to the Europeans, made a fool of himself in front of the Europeans. Europeans are critical in this endeavor. See, that's one thing Obama really understood, that you really need to get the Europeans on board if you're going to deal with Iran. Now, Obama did it in the wrong way, but he at least understood the value of that diplomacy. Trump, unfortunately, does not.